Hello TLC family, welcome to Spread Love Not Fear Week 3. I'll be sharing today's word of the week, which is the evangelism is always relational. And at the end of today's video, I'll be sharing this week's evangelism challenge. Typically when we think of evangelism, we think of two types of evangelism. The first being relational friendship evangelism, and that has to do with fostering long-term relationships with people in our circles. For example, our friends, our families, our co-workers, our classmates. And then we think of, secondly, a cold evangelism, which is evangelism in short-term encounters to strangers. An example of this is like street evangelism. However, I don't think this is actually a very helpful distinction. I think this is part of the reason why so many people are turned off by the idea of evangelism, particularly the second kind, called cold evangelism. Right? It's in the name. Cold and impersonal. It gives off the idea of a salesman who's trying to sell you something you don't want, or that spam call you receive that's intrusive and you don't like. And so it gives us a reason to say, I only focus on relational evangelism, but not cold evangelism. And I don't like cold evangelism. And you're right, we should all be uncomfortable with any approach to sharing the gospel that is described as cold and impersonal. And that's because the gospel is the opposite of those things. We believe in a relational God, a relational fall, sin, savior, salvation, gospel, and eternity that are all relational. Therefore, evangelism must fundamentally be a relational and personal endeavor. So instead of saying evangelism is cold or either relational, I think all evangelism is always relational. And a better way to think about it is think about evangelizing to people we already know and have a relationship with versus evangelizing to strangers. And I know what you're thinking. When it comes to evangelizing to strangers, it might sound a bit intimidating. Maybe you think of this kind of guy who's trying to climb a mountain without any ropes. It's crazy, right? It's only for those strong, courageous, extroverted, bold Christians. But it's not for me, right? I tend to be more introverted myself. So personally, I would gravitate more towards the relational kind of evangelism in more personal, long-term relationship settings. But I hope through this video you will see that, hey, rather than seeing these as two different approaches to evangelism, we will begin to see them actually as one endeavor. And that one endeavor is the making of disciples of all nations, as Jesus called us to, which includes evangelizing to both friends, people we know long-term, and also to strangers that we may know only for short-term. And perhaps if we did this, we would begin to see that the two are more closely linked than we initially thought. Let me give you guys an example. For example, there's also just as much a need for courage, boldness, and urgency, and sometimes even more in evangelizing to our long-term relationships as we do for strangers. It's very easy to become complacent in our long-term relationships, thinking people will simply catch the gospel without us ever having to open our mouths. We know that the gospel is a message that needs to be heard. And if that's true, then there comes a point where you will have to be bold to speak up. In the same way, evangelizing to strangers too requires us to be willing to be vulnerable and open up our lives to someone else. That it too requires a willingness to invest our time to intentionally engage with, listen to, and be emotionally available to another person, as much as our long-term relationships would. So the temptation is for those who focus exclusively on short-term relationship encounters is to become detached in their approach, to see evangelism as a task we get off our Christian checklists, kind of like I went to FOMO this week, so that you can get that off your conscience. But if you do that, what happens is people can become a project rather than the unique individuals who bear the image of God and desperately need the good news of hope. And that instead of having a cookie cutter approach where we mechanically regurgitate a memorized presentation regardless of who the person is, it would require us a relational approach to evangelism, first to listen to the person before us, and then in prayerful humility, love, patience, and wisdom personalize and contextualize the gospel to that person. So the reality is we need both a short-term evangelism to strangers and a long-term evangelism, like friendship evangelism in the church. And both need to be relational. And ideally, they would both be linked, where our short-term evangelism would open up more opportunities for our long-term ones. And why do we need both? Because if we focus only on evangelism to strangers short-term, what the Bible calls us not to make converts, but Jesus calls us to make disciples. And you can't make disciples without long-term relationships. And that's why we need the local church. Our hope is in short-term evangelism that they would turn into long-term ones as we invite them to our church or connect them with another church in their area. And practically, if you focus only on evangelism to people you already know, what will happen is eventually there's going to be a limit to the number of people you evangelize to. Although we should, of course, continue to foster long-term relational evangelism, we should also not limit it to that and also accompany it with evangelism to strangers. It's the problem with a friendship exclusive evangelism, right? Evangelism of exclusively trying to make friends to share the gospel is that it has too narrow a focus. Once you have a quota of friends, there isn't much room for anyone new in your life. And thus we pass over others, like that person at the coffee shop, because they're not the target of our evangelistic efforts. It gives us an excuse not to witness, because if we're not a friend of the person, we're exempt from speaking to them. This may explain why so few Christians witness today, because they have so few friends, and friends they have are not interested in the gospel. Instead of making friends, hoping that one day they will be interested in the gospel, we should find people who are interested in the gospel and befriend them. In other words, we need to expand our circle of friends. If we focus only on the friends that we have, then we're gonna miss out on all the other opportunities that are out there. You'll be surprised how many of them actually are willing to listen, how many are hungry to hear the message of hope. And so what the Bible calls us to is actually to be more than just a friend, right? Not just to practice friendship evangelism that's exclusive to our circles of a group of people we know, but to practice evangelism that is friendly. Because Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. In other words, according to the Bible and Jesus' words, we are called to be more than just friends, right? If we're honest, who are the kinds of people who are in our friends groups? They're usually the people we're comfortable around. They're the people who are like us. People who aren't too much of a burden. But Jesus says, hey, we're called more than just a friend, but we're called to be servants of all, to love even our enemies, to even lay down our life for others. And that requires us to actually go beyond just the long-term relationships that are already in place in our lives and to go to strangers. The reality is, evangelism that matches the gospel is evangelism that goes after people who were once outcast and strangers and even enemies of God, who God brought near through his pursuing love. And so I hope that this week's challenge will help you take a step towards that direction, that you would go beyond your circle group of friends and greet a stranger, someone you don't know. And I know it's not easy to talk to strangers. I'm an introvert myself. And it really begins by just saying hi and introducing yourself, getting to know their name. As Milan said, notice the people around you, name them, be able to name them, be able to be open to the Spirit to lead you to people that you normally would not engage, you normally wouldn't talk to. Our second challenge is actually to participate in our Fishers of Men meeting, which we do every second and fourth Thursday of the month. Fishers of Men's really exists to be a space that focuses and is an intentional space for our church to reach out to strangers. And reaching out to strangers isn't easy, so hopefully this will be a place where you can do it together. And if it's your first time, you can just watch and learn as much as you can. So it's no pressure at all. And we usually have a short lesson before we go out to evangelize at the mall. And so I'll come out for that as well. And there I'll be teaching how to share the gospel in a real way. And it will really provide practical ways and principles that will help you be more confident in your evangelism, both in long-term and short-term relationships. And one thing cool is that Titi, she came up with these cool cards. She updated the old ones that were a little scary to look at. And so these are a lot more welcoming. And so as we talk and have conversations with people, we can actually invite them to our church as well through these cards. And so we encourage you, please take part in our weekly challenge, our weekly word of the week, this video. And this Thursday, we have a fasting of food and social media for 24 hours, and just set it apart to intentionally pray. Well, I hope you guys have a wonderful week. Thank you, TLC family. See you at FOMO, hopefully. Don't miss out.